Hello everyone, my name is Montserrat Valdes and I'm a senior scientist at cloudlims.com. Welcome to my presentation. Today, I'm talking about LIMS data migration. Let's explore together how this process ensures efficiency, integrity, and security in our lab operations. So during this presentation, we are going to explore the following. What is LIMS data migration and its challenges? The steps, approaches, and best practices for LIMS data migration, as well as some case studies. So the first question we need to ask is, what is LIMS data migration? Data migration refers to the process of transferring data from one system or location to another. This could involve moving data from an old LIMS to a new one, upgrading to a newer version of the LIMS, or consolidating data from different sources into a single LIMS. Why do we need this process, this data migration from one LIMS to another? Well, there are several reasons. Like we often see like potential clients approaching us because they have one of these following citations. The first one is a system upgrade or replacement. Labs might decide to upgrade their current LIMS to get better features, enhanced functionality, and better support for their evolving laboratory workflows. The second one is a vendor change. So labs might opt to switch vendors because they want to get a better customer support, because of cost considerations, or alignment with a specific lab requirement that their current LIMS is not completely meeting. Also because of compliance requirements, as we know, some of the labs might operate in a very strict and regulated environments, so they want their LIMS to be able to support them to achieve compliance with these regulations. Another one is the business expansions. So we often see these mergers, acquisitions, or expansions, and then we need to consolidate data from different locations into a unified LIMS. Also, labs might need this data migration because of data centralization or a cloud adoptions. Sometimes labs go from on-premise LIMS to a cloud one because they want to get more flexibility, better scalability, and they want to reduce their infrastructure costs. Another reason for this migration is the enhanced reporting and analytics features, legacy system decommissioning, and security enhancements. There are several challenges associated in this process. Some of these are the following. The data loss risk. So as we know, when we are migrating the data from one LIMS to another, often we see that the lab stop their operation and many analytical instruments get shut down. During this process, some data might get lost. So we need to be very careful in this aspect. The data format conversion complexity. When we are talking about two different LIMS interfaces, we will notice that they don't use the exact same format. So we have to be very careful as well in here because like we want to be able to retrieve and access data from one system to another. The third risk is the quality assurance complexity. So we have to, this is a long process, and sometimes it might be costly, but even with these circumstances, we still need to have the capability to ensure quality in all the data that we are transferring and in all the laboratory workflow. So we have to make sure that we are always providing quality in our services. The fourth aspect are data security concerns. So here the data is in transit. So this data will be vulnerable to an unauthorized access, loss, or breaches. So we need to make sure that we have the security features to avoid these situations and safeguard the data. And finally, we have the cost implications. Sometimes this LIMS data migration might be a costly process because it might involve the purchase of new hardware or software, as well as hiring specialized IT personnel to help us to do these transitions of information from one LIMS to the other. In this image, we can see the steps for a successful LIMS data migration. I'm going to explain in detail each of these steps in the following slides. So the first step is the planning step, following by the data extraction, transformation, cleansing, and validation. The last step is the data loading. So the first step is the planning. So the planning might consume a significant amount of time, but we have to make sure that we do a good planning to minimize the business downtime and avoid laboratory data loss. Your laboratory should be able to allocate the necessary resources for this data migration, and then you will save some money and time. Also, if you have a good and reputable LIMS vendor, they will assign a project manager to your lab. Then they will assist you with any concerns or any challenge that arise during the migration process. While planning a data migration, we need to consider the following aspects. The first one is the stakeholder alignment. So we need to make sure that all the stakeholders, such as data owners, the functional team, the lab management, they have the same goals, the same scopes, and they have a good communication. The second one is the legacy data evaluation. We need to ask questions such as, do you require all the legacy data in your new LIMS? Or some of these old information can be stored, like you don't need to transfer it to the new LIMS. The third aspect is the data suitability. We need to evaluate all the data in our legacy system to see that all this data is suitable for migration, and to what extent we will need some manual data entry. We also need to consider the regulatory compliance. So like which are mandatory, which documentation is mandatory to keep uh, some regulatory standpoints, some compliance guidelines. So to maintain some accreditations, so we have to keep in mind all of these regulatory compliance situations. Another aspect is the system maintenance strategy. So when we have this transition from the old system to the new one, we have to think here we are going to maintain both systems simultaneously, or how we are going to complete this transition. I'm going to explain a little bit more in detail this aspect in the following slides as well. And finally, the migration timeline. So what is the proposed timeline for the migration, and how it can be executed with minimal disruption of your lab operations? The second step in this data migration process is the data extraction. This refers to the process of retrieving data from the existing LIMS in preparation for its transfer to the new one. For this data extraction, we need to consider all kind of information, such as sample information, test results, instrument data, user details, and all of the data that is involved in your lab operations need to be considered in this data extraction. Before the migration, the data needs to be evaluated and it needs to undergo a complete audit. We need to identify what type of data we have. So it might be a structured data, such as tables or columns, this information that is easy to extract and to transfer to the new LIMS. And we also need to consider the unstructured data, such as images or PDF files. So we need to consider how we are going to transfer this type of unstructured data. And we also need to consider any data dependencies between different data sources. So all of these should be considered in the mapping process. It's important to have a LIMS that supports the exports of large amount of data in a simple and practical way. As we can see here, we have the sample management model of a LIMS. And as we can see, but just by clicking one icon, we will be able to export all the sample data information into Excel or CSV report. So when we are selecting a LIMS, we need to look for these kind of features that will make our life easier when we want to migrate the data. The third step in this process is the data transformation. This is the process of matching attributes from one database to another using a template. This will vary in complexity depending on the amount of data, the data types, the difference between the legacy data source and the new LIMS, etc. For example, in our current LIMS, we might have a field in one of those databases that in just one field, they have the city and state. And then if we look to the new LIMS systems, we will realize that these are two different fields. They will have a city field and a state field. So even though these are small differences, if we don't notice them and we don't address them on time, and then this might lead to bigger difficulties in the future. So it's very important to do a very careful mapping of all this data. Here we can see that some LIMS provide some templates like this one we have here. So they will allow you to select each of the attributes in your tables and select the location in a specific Excel or CSV file. So for example, we can select the location in a column. You will have these alphanumeric characters, for example. So you can specify all of these in this kind of templates. So this is another feature to keep in mind when looking for different LIMS vendors. The fourth step in this data migration process is the data cleaning. This involves identifying and eliminating unreliable, inaccurate, duplicated, or outdated information from our data sets, tables, databases, etc. This will prevent errors and inaccuracies from being transferred to the new system. So all this information that is not useful and that it has errors in it, it has to be eliminated so it doesn't get transferred to the new LIMS. There are some key aspects to consider while doing a data cleaning. So we need to detect the errors and correct them. Identifying and rectifying these errors, such as misspellings, inaccuracies, or incomplete information. We need to remove the duplicate data. We also need to do an standardization, this to ensure consistency and conformity in all data formats, units, and structures. We have to make sure that we have a standard data in both LIMS systems. We need to have a verification confirming that all the necessary data fields are populated and complete, avoiding gaps or missing informations. We also need to perform data integrity checks and normalization of data. The next step is the data validation. This refers to the process of ensuring that the data transfer from the old system to the new one is accurate, consistent, and meets the specified requirements. In other words, to ensure a successful migration, we need to test, and keep testing until we make sure that everything is working as expected. The final step is the data loading. These steps involve populating the databases, tables, and structures of the new LIMS with the data that has been extracted, transformed, validated during earlier process. And also, this phase is critical for the overall LIMS data migration process as it finalizes the transfer of information to the new systems. By loading the data and starting using the LIMS, and following these steps, we can make sure that we are going to be working with accurate, reliable, and updated information. It's important to have a LIMS that supports the import of large amounts of data in a simple and practical way. As we can see here in this screen, we have the documentation module, and just by clicking on one icon, we will transfer a huge amount of SOPs, test methods, of all the documentation necessary that you need to have in place in your lab. So this is another feature to keep in mind when selecting a LIMS. So you have to be able to import large amounts of data just by one click. During the post-migration evaluation, we need to make sure that the data migrated aligns with expectations, meets quality standards, and ensures effective operations of the new LIMS. This process validates the migration success, ensures laboratory data integrity, and addresses any arising issues during the transitions. The key aspects of this post-migration evaluation include the following. A data integrity check. We have to make sure that all the data is accurate and complete. So we also need to make sure the data integrity was maintained during the transfer. We also need to check the system functionality. So we need to make sure that all the LIMS features work as expected. This includes testing features, workflows, or any custom configuration that we perform during the migration process. We also need some user acceptance testing, the performance monitoring, and the validation of customizations. So if there were some configurations or modification in the new LIMS, we need to make sure that they function properly and they are not impacting the everyday operation of your lab. We also need to perform a documentation review, security and compliance checks. So we need to verify that all the security measures are in place. So only authorized people access the information, for example, and we need to ensure compliance with relevant industry and regulatory standards. Also, we need to perform some data retrieval testing. This means that we need to make sure that all the users are able to access the information they need when they need it. We also need to fix bugs and make the necessary adjustments, and also a user training assessment. This means that we need to make sure that all the lab personnel knows how to use the new LIMS interface and to see where they need additional training or support. Now, let's talk about the approaches to successful LIMS data migration. So when we are replacing a LIMS, there is a final decisions we need to make. The selection of the go live option. There are three methods to consider. The first one is the parallel, the second the incremental, and the third one the big bang approach. Let's explore each of these approaches. So the first one is the parallel approach. In this, simultaneous operation of both existing and new LIMS system happens for a period of time. This approach ensures consistency and accuracy in the new system. So I had some experience while I was working in a lab where they used to have like all the reporting happen in Excel. So then they started to migrate all this data to a LIMS. So they were having like some clients that they were not as strict. They kept reporting everything on Excel, and then the most regulated ones, they started to use the LIMS. This was very good in keeping consistency in the data and reporting. However, we have to consider that it will be a longer process because you are maintaining two different systems simultaneously. And also you have to have the capability in, for example, instruments, analytical instruments, to support both systems. It will also be more expensive because you will need to have the IT infrastructure to support both systems. So if an error occurs in the current LIMS, in the new LIMS, then you will have to have the capability to support this new system and the old one as well. The second approach is the incremental. In this method, data is migrated incrementally, often in stages, rather than all at once. This approach allows for a step-by-step migration process, reducing the risk of disruptions and enabling ongoing laboratory operations. An example of this method is like, for example, you divide your migration process in different phases. In the phase one, you decide to set up all the system configurations, such as setting up calculations, holding times, preparation steps for your samples, and automatically emails sent to clients for reports and invoices. So all of that can be we perform in a first stage. During a second stage, you can perform all the instrument integration and the validation and verification testing. And finally, during the last step, you might consider to do all the third-party integration. The third approach is the think bank. This approach ensures the complete transfer of laboratory data from the existing LIMS to the new one in a single operation. The transition from the old system to the new one happens at once and during a predefined good cutover period. This approach is the fastest, but is also the less used, like among these three approaches. Why? Because your lab operation needs to be very simple to be able to transfer it, like, let's say, in 2 weeks. It has to be a very simple workflow. And also you need to consider that having this system one, like, you just want the transfer to be done in 2 weeks, it might impact your customer service to your clients, because it might impact, for example, the turnaround time. And also, in case you need some data that was stored in the previous LIMS system, if you just like stop using it, you don't have access to it anymore. So it might be difficult to go back and look to some data or some workflows that you used to have in your previous system. So this is the fastest, but it's also the less common one. Now, there are several recommended practices for a successful LIMS data migration. The first one is a comprehensive planning. As I just mentioned previously, we just have to take the time to allocate resources and to have a clear scope, objective, and timeline. This will avoid these shutdown operations of your lab. The second one is the engage of stakeholders and LIMS vendor support. So we need to make sure that all the stakeholders, including lab staff, IT personnel, management, all of them are involved in this transition. And also if we have the vendor support, this will make our life easier because they know, they have experience, and they will be able to address any challenge or any issues during the process. The third recommendation is the data backup and security measures. So before migration, we have to back up all data to prevent data loss. And we also need to implement security measures to protect sensitive information during this transfer of information. The pilot testing. So it's very important to just start testing with a portion of all your lab data. So instead of having all your data loaded and just go live, so you just test a little bit of your data and then make sure that all the features work properly, and then you can go with more confidence and go and load and work with all your data. Another one is the risk management. We need to think about all the potential risk that can happen during this data migration. And we need to think in any way to solve them if they happen. And finally, the feedback and continuous improvements. So we need to get feedback from the end users after we finish this data migration process. So we need to ask them how is it going? Is it working well? So we can add some features, remove some of them that are not working properly, and then we will have a more efficient transition process. Here we have some case studies of LIMS data migration that we have seen. So the first one is a biotech company. They operate in a highly regulated industry, and then they need a LIMS that support this high regulated environment. So they have to have different modules that allow them to keep the standards and meet compliance in their industry. The second one is an environmental lab. They are currently use an on-premise LIMS, but they decide to go to a cloud-based one. This will improve the scalability, their accessibility of data, and then it will reduce the cost they have to invest for IT infrastructure or personnel to maintain these LIMS on-premise. The third scenario is a clinical laboratory that decides to change vendors for their LIMS because they want a better customer support and they want LIMS that better fits their current workflows. Now, I want to emphasize this, like when you are selecting a new LIMS vendor, you need to look for a complementary data migration. So some vendors will provide this complementary support and they will help you to address any challenges that happens during these transitions. What are the benefits of having this as a complementary services? Well, it will enhance your return of investment and will reduce the overall cost. It also will streamline the adoption process and it will safeguard all the data integrity during the transition. So as a conclusion from this presentation, we can say that LIMS data migration is a complex and transformative process. Laboratories undertake this process to enhance their efficiency, to embrace technological advancement and meet evolving industry standards. In order to have a successful LIMS data migration, you need several aspects such as collaboration of all the stakeholders, good communication, commitment to data integrity, and if you have the support of a vendor, that would be great. And finally, let's go back to this LIMS vendor selection, where you have to look like you have some features in the LIMS that will help you to transfer large amounts of data in a simple way. And also, if you have this data migration support as a complementary service, you will improve the, the operations of your lab and you will reduce the shutdown times. So you will save a lot of money and a lot of time. So thank you for your attention. I hope that you have found this presentation useful. Thanks.